Once again, it's time to take a trip to 1968. So without further ado, let's revisit some cool British singles released in May of that year. Let's begin. May 1968 saw the release of not only one of the greatest singles by the Stones, but one of the greatest singles of the 60s. The single, which was their first to be produced by Jimmy Miller, had a huge influence on the music scene as a whole. By May 1968, psychedelia seemed to have grown increasingly more mellow and poppy, and most psychedelic bands seemed too reliant on fancy effects and the latest studio tricks. The Stones, on the other hand, seemed to go the opposite way. Instead of going for the latest studio effects and tricks, Jumpin' Jack Flash featured the group going for an almost lo-fi approach. And the song featured the Stones experimenting with primitive recording devices such as early cassette recorders, which were used to record Keith Richards' guitars.
That's the way I did Street Fighting, man. Yeah, that's the way I did Jumpin' Jack Flash. It was all recorded on one of those little cassette recorders, you know. Because the problem you've got now with rock and roll is that in the last few years, the technical thing has gone ahead so fast that things are a little clean. And I mean, that's not the way rock and roll's put together. So you find yourself with all these clean tapes trying to dirty them up all the time, you know, trying to stomp on them and rip them up. And, you know, 16 tracks are very handy sometimes, you know. But also, there are other times when 2 are enough.
This switch back to crude and organic and earthy sounds had a huge influence on the whole music scene. A few months later, in July 1968, the release of the debut album by the band, Music from Big Pink, seemed to confirm that this return to more organic sounds was definitely here to stay. And it could be argued that both Jumpin' Jack Flash and the band's first album are the two most influential releases of 1968. The White Album by the Beatles, which was released 6 months later in November 1968, was also influenced by this return to more earthy and organic sounds. The single got unanimously excellent reviews, with most reviewers agreeing that the single provided the sort of excitement that the music scene desperately needed. The B-side was also a gem. Child of the Moon was the last gasp of the Stones in psychedelic mood, which is not surprising considering that the song had been written during the recording sessions for their previous album. The single reached number 1 in the UK and became a worldwide hit. In the States, it reached number 3 according to Billboard and number 1 according to Cashbox. Another excellent release from May 1968 was this single by Donovan. The song, which featured a harder rock sound than his previous material, was written in India, where Donovan studied transcendental meditation with the Beatles. The track was arranged by future Led Zeppelin bassist John Paul Jones, who also played bass on the song. And according to Donovan himself, the track also featured Jimmy Page on guitar and John Bonham on drums, although there are different accounts regarding the musicians who played on the track. Record Mirror wrote,
"This is all kind of whirring and jerky and offbeat, and it wouldn't surprise me if it's a hit. Some odd electronic effect is used on the voice, and the song is starkly simple but instantly gripping. The backing is tremendous as well. Superb guitar figures, strong drumming, and stacks of excitement."
The single reached number 4 in Britain and number 5 in the States.
Hounds and the horsemen chased by the fox. 10,000 words in a cardboard box.
In 1967, Tomorrow were one of the most popular bands from the psychedelic underground scene in London. The group, which featured future Yes guitarist Steve Howe, got a lot of hype in the press, and they seemed destined for fame and fortune. But unfortunately, the band never really took off. By May 1968, Tomorrow had already broken up, and Twink, the group's drummer, formed this duo called the Aquarian Age. The A-side was a great psychedelic track which was later re-recorded for the drummer's first solo album.
Tin soldiers, they might be in tune with 3 madmen waiting for a full moon.
But despite the quality of the song and a few good reviews, the single went pretty much unnoticed. Record Mirror wrote,
"Very offbeat and ambitious performance, earning a Record of the Week tag, and with great sounds of a wide variety. Must listen carefully. It's worth the effort."
Shortly after the release of the single, Twink joined the Pretty Things and played on their psychedelic masterpiece SF Sorrow. After his brief stint with the Pretty Things, Twink formed the Pink Fairies, who released a few excellent albums in the very late 60s and early 70s.
Anyone for tennis, wouldn't that be nice?
May 1968 also saw the release of one of Cream's oddest singles. Eric Clapton wrote the song as the theme tune for a biker exploitation film called The Savage Seven. And the lyrics were written by Martin Sharp, who was the album cover designer for Cream's Disraeli Gears and Wheels of Fire. Record Mirror wrote,
Subtitled The Savage 7 theme, this is a strangely fascinating disc. Although I'm not sure what it's all about, it has one of those puzzling, enigmatic lyrics, and it's set to a throbbing beat. There's an ear-catching guitar sound going on behind the solo vocal, and the added strings have been exceptionally well molded to the mood of the disc. You have to listen to it carefully because it's not a record that bulldozes its way into your mind. It's restrained, almost delicate, and gently compelling.
The B-side was a strange Ginger Baker composition.
Pressed Rat and Warthog closed down their shop. They didn't want to.
The single reached number 40 in Britain and number 64 in the States.
Over the hills of Chackney-Ball, pushing on with the luminous snow.
Another highlight from May 1968 was this excellent single by Les Fleur de Lys. This was the group's fifth single and one of the best records they ever issued. One of the highlights of the song was the killer guitar break by Bryn Howard. Record Retailer wrote,
Though the vocal line is fine, this really stands or falls by a tremendous beat rhythm which really thuds and thunders away. Good guitar figure. It could garner big support.
Unfortunately, just like the group's previous releases, the single went unnoticed and didn't make the British charts.
Children dance night and day. Religion was being born down in Monterey.
This single by Eric Burdon was released in the States in December 1967. But it didn't get a UK release until May 1968. In Britain, the single was released as a double A-side along with Anything, a song which had already appeared on Burdon's first album. The song provides an oral account of the Monterey Pop Festival, and Eric Burdon mentions several of the acts who performed at the festival such as Jimi Hendrix,
Jimi Hendrix, baby, believe me, set the world on fire.
and The Who.
The Who exploded into fire and light.
The single got mostly positive reviews, although most reviewers agreed that its chances of becoming a hit in Britain were slim. In effect, just like most of his 45s from that period, the single failed to connect with the record-buying public in Britain, and the record didn't make the charts. In the States, however, the single became a big hit, reaching number 12 and remaining in the charts for several weeks.
Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch.
One of the most bizarre 45s from May 1968 was this strangely psychedelic single by Boeing, Duveen and the Beautiful Sue.
And the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave.
Both sides of the single were musical adaptations of poems by Lewis Carroll, and this is one of the earliest productions by Tony Visconti.
But beneath a sunny sky, lingering onward dreamily, in an evening of July.
The artist behind this single was Sam Hutt, a qualified doctor and associate of Pink Floyd. Record Mirror wrote,
Having been bombarded with epistles by this doomy-faced gent, I took notice of the record. In fact, it's in with chances. The setting of group sound plus Lewis Carroll crazy lyrics comes off. Boeing himself is certainly not shot down by the exercise, and it deserves to do very well indeed.
Shortly after the release of this single, Sam Hutt had an epiphany after a meeting with Graham Parsons, and he became a country western artist performing under the name of Hank Wangford. The single didn't chart, but the record has achieved cult status through its appearance on compilations of obscure psychedelic singles from the 60s.
When Jessamine knows, a part of me knows, I'm not really living.
One of the biggest British hits from May 1968 was this track by The Casuals. The song was written by Marty Wilde and Ronnie Scott, and it became a massive hit all over Europe. Penny Valentine wrote,
I liked this very much when the Bystanders did it some months ago, and I must admit that this is, if anything, an improvement on the original, which is rare in itself. It has gained an impact with a very solid production that builds nicely.
It's too far away, and she makes my life a dream.
The single reached number 2 in Britain, and it was also a top 10 hit in several European countries and in Australia. The single was released in the States in September 1968, but it failed to chart there. In a BBC interview from 1996, Paul Weller described the track as one of his all-time favorite songs.
I know a man who lives in a tree. He sees things no one else can see. Living in a tree.
May 1968 also saw the release of this excellent B-side by a group called Focal Point. The single was released by the Beatles' Apple Publishing. Record Mirror wrote,
Meeting Paul McCartney in Hyde Park and persuading him that you've got plenty of musical talent isn't something that happens every day. But believe it or not, it happened to Focal Point. This 5-man group, 4 of whom come from Liverpool, struck up conversation with Paul, gave him an impromptu audition, and were soon talking business to the late Brian Epstein, who gave them their name. Now happily signed to Apple and with a Durham contract, they're hoping the same kind of luck is going to make their first disc for the label a hit.
The A-side of the single was a very forgettable ballad that went completely unnoticed.
If I promise to love you forever and ever.
But just like many singles from that period, the B-side has appeared on multiple Psych compilations over the years.
Deep inside your heart I'll do. Every day I need to know I'm there. I'm there. I'm there.
Prior to becoming one of the most popular prog bands in the UK, Peter Gabriel and Company were a pop band struggling to make a name for themselves. This single from May 1968 was the group's second 45. At this point, Genesis was still managed and produced by Jonathan King. But the group sounded more confident than on their debut single, and Gabriel's voice sounds closer to the way it sounded on his more well-known progressive material from the early 70s.
The fireside warmth that comforts me, the peace for all my thoughts.
Record Mirror wrote,
Jonathan King produced this and did a good job. Good song, and the treatment is suitably chilly if you get the gist. The actual chorus is strong if a shade overcomplicated sound-wise. It's nice though.
Just like the previous release, the single flopped. And speaking of progressive rock,
He runs a little shop with a room at the top and a mortgage all around it. He's a 1 in a million.
Robert Fripp and Michael Giles didn't leave their mark in music until they formed King Crimson in 1969. But the two musicians had already been members of this trio. This was the group's first single, which was issued just a month after the band's debut album. Both the single and the album sold poorly, and the only mention that the single got in the press was this humorous review by Keith Moon, who didn't seem to like it at all. Ian MacDonald joined the group shortly after the release of this single and played on their second 45. In late 1968, Peter Giles left the group, so Michael Giles, Robert Fripp and Ian MacDonald went on to form the first lineup of King Crimson, rounded out by Greg Lake and lyricist Peter Sinfield. And as they say, the rest is history.
He's a 1 in a million.
I'm the muffin the man. Here I am, and you know I can love you if you let me have a muffin now and then you won't forget me.
Those of you who are into psychedelic pop with a strong emphasis on pop are probably already familiar with this song by the World of Oz. The release of the single was backed by a £10,000 publicity launch that promoted the group as the biggest shake-up since the Beatles, and the group's management installed them in a luxury flat in Mayfair's Park Lane. The lead singer was also famous for sporting one of the worst haircuts of the 60s. The group got a lot of publicity, with several ads promoting the single and multiple interviews in the press. The single became a top 10 hit in several European countries, achieving its highest chart position in the Netherlands, where the song reached number 6. The single, however, only managed to reach number 52 in Britain. The group released 3 more singles, and broke up in 1969 shortly after the release of their first full-length album.
Although I know that other people
on you. The secret safe within my brain.
Elmer Gantry's Velvet Opera are one of many psychedelic bands who went unnoticed in the 60s, but were later rediscovered by enthusiasts of British psychedelia. Their first album has been reissued several times over the years and has become a bit of a cult classic. Both sides of this single were featured on their first record. The A-side was an obvious ode to the Devil's Lettuce. The B-side was a track called Dreamy.
Hollywood's bring you dreams to eat and lots of sugar memories for you to always keep.
Later in 1969, the band's lead singer left the group, and they continued as Velvet Opera. The single failed to chart.
I still want you by my side, just to help me dry the tears that I've cried.
The Koobas were an excellent band that always seemed to be on the verge of making it big but never quite managed to reach widespread popularity. This release from May 1968 was a Cat Stevens composition that had already been a hit in 1967 when the song was recorded by P.P. Arnold. Penny Valentine wrote,
Cat Stevens' finest song, once a hit for P.P. Arnold, is now given a vanilla fudge treatment by the Koobas. It could do well for them, although you'll have to hear it a couple of times to really let it get through.
The single didn't chart, but their version of the song has achieved cult status through its appearance on compilations such as the Second Nuggets box set. The group ended up breaking up in 1969.
From home today. Wait till the morning sunshine.
May 1968 also saw the release of this excellent psychedelic B-side by the Idle Race, a group which was led by future ELO leader Jeff Lynne. The A-side was a Beatles-inspired number with a few music hall elements.
Please wait for me, I'll be there at the end of the road.
To my ears though, the highlight here was the B-side. Just like most 45s by the Idle Race, the single was largely ignored by the press and it sank without a trace.
Tracy took a trip down river. Goodbye, Tracy. Tracy has
gone. This soul-flavored psychedelic track by The Executive is one of many songs that were banned by the BBC.
Look at her there, drifted away down the river, leaving the clothes that she wore on the shore.
The group was led by journalist Roy Carr, who became a well-known staff member of the New Musical Express later in 1970. The B-side was a song called Gardena Dreamer.
In the morning sunlight, has she been there before?
This track is probably the first ever British song to display influences of Forever Changes by Love.
Suddenly, there in the looking glass, you read yourself and what has come to pass.
Due to the fact that the song was banned by the BBC, the single didn't get any airplay on Radio 1, and as a result, it sank without a trace. But once again, this 45 was rediscovered years later when both sides of the single were featured in compilations such as Bam Carusso's Rubble series.
They're now going to stand the current British number one.
I hope you enjoyed this trip back to May 1968. See you next time.